We have here today Professor Wolfgang Palaver from University of Innsbruck, Austria, who has kindly agreed to talk to us about his memories of Professor René Girard and how he came to hear from him, about him, and when he met him. So, Professor Palaver, let me start off by asking you, when did you first hear about Professor René Girard?
So I'm not absolutely sure about the months, but it was either late in the 70s, definitely about 1980. So that was just the first 2 or 3 semesters studying theology at the University of Innsbruck, Catholic theology. I became a theologian because of my involvement of the Catholic Catholic youth movement, and we were engaged in the peace movement of the late 70s, early 80s in Europe. And for this reason, I started to study theology. And so I was interested in nonviolence, in violence and religion, and came quickly. I met Raimund Schwager. He was not teaching the students of the first semesters, but I heard quite soon about him, and his book, Master Be Scapegoats, was widely discussed at that time. It was just 2 years old. And so through Raimund Schwager, I heard about René Girard. And soon in the early 80s, I started to read Violence and the Sacred. That was the first book that I read in English carefully. My English was at that time rusty and not really developed. And so I walked through the book word by word and sentence by sentence.
Okay. And when did you meet Professor Girard?
It was 6 years later. So in 1986, Raimund Schwager with 2 German professors of the Freie Universität Berlin organized the first German conference on mimetic theory, or conference in the German-speaking world. It happened in Stuttgart in Germany, and Schwager invited me as a young PhD student. I was just starting to write my dissertation on Thomas Hobbes from a Girardian point of view. So after 3-4 years reading Girard eagerly, I was becoming a scholar of mimetic theory, and I was very glad to be invited to this first meeting. So I met him for the first time in 1986 in September.
In Germany, in Stuttgart.
In Germany, in Stuttgart, yes.
And you kept having correspondence with René Girard afterwards?
Yeah, no, not directly. Through Raimund Schwager, we were in contact. So there was this group slowly developing, a group in Innsbruck, but also 4 years later, the Colloquium on Violence and Religion was founded, and Raimund Schwager became his first president. So through Schwager, we became connected. And I think now, I do not know the exact year, soon after, maybe 2 years after the meeting in Stuttgart, René Girard got the honorary doctorate of the University of Innsbruck. So he visited Innsbruck directly. And so we had 2 days talks and discussion with him, and I was allowed to drive him to the airport and so on. So it was going to become closer. Also, the dean of the chapel of Stanford University was also in Stuttgart, Robert Hamilton Kelly.
Yes.
And I became a friend of him, and he visited me, I think, in 1990, and then organized and helped me, because in 1991, 1992, after I finished my PhD in Innsbruck, I went for a whole year to Stanford University as a research fellow. And so that was the time when I really was able for a whole year to connect with Girard quite closely. And we had a bi-weekly little Girardian seminar that we organized in the Center of International Security and Arms Control. But I also... CSAC, yes, yeah. And I also went to two classes of Girard. So at that time, he was teaching a big undergraduate course about his Shakespeare book. So there was every week another Shakespeare play, the topic. And then in the later summer, he gave for me very helpful seminar on Aeschylus' Humanities.
Yeah.
And I participated in this seminar. So these were two seminars at Stanford University, and there was this more private meeting, bi-weekly seminar of Girardian scholars. So that really got me very close to Girard and mimetic theory, and I'm still very glad that this was able, some friends and other people, and also the Austrian Science Foundation enabled me to go to Stanford for a whole year with my family.
Wonderful. And you have a book on Girard called Mimetic Theory, René Girard's Mimetic Theory.
Yeah,
in German.
That was a follow-up in some way, because when I returned to Innsbruck in 1992, I was eager to teach a course on mimetic theory, and we had at that time a slot for contemporary philosophical thinking, and I offered a course on mimetic theory for about the next 10 years. Every fall, I taught a semester mimetic theory, and the final outcome of this 10 years is my book on mimetic theory that came out in 2004 and was translated into English, the third version of it in 2013. And it was very difficult to finish this book, really. And I know from René Girard himself, he and Raimund Schwager sometimes made phone calls. And on one of the phone calls, they discussed about my book, because I announced it, I think, in about the year 2000, but it took me another 4 years to finish it. So they were in between quite sure that this is a book that will never be published. But in 2003, we organized.
They thought it wouldn't get published.
No, they thought I will never be able to finish it.
You will never finish it, okay.
Yeah, so because I was making some additions and broadened it and so on. Sure. But in 2003, I organized a huge conference with Girard in Innsbruck, organized also by the Colloquium on Violence and Religion. And a half year, so I was the main organizer. It was a lot of work with more than 200 participants. And about a half year before, I thought I would be really an idiot to organize this huge Girardian conference and not finish my book just for this conference. Right. So I did that. So just when the conference started, the book was out.
So you got the book out for the conference?
Yes. But only in German. So I mean, most of the participants, that the conference was in English, of course. So only those few who could understand German were able to buy it. And it took
translated into English. I saw the English translation does exist.
Yeah, it was 10 years later. It came out in English, and it's received very well. And I think even the English version, I didn't do the translation myself, but an American philosophy student who is a journalist now for American radio in Germany. He did a very good translation and sometimes smoothed out some of my more complex thoughts. So it's the English translation is very well received and very well done. So that gave me some input into the more international world.
Right. Wonderful.
Also, Raimund Schwager is responsible for the delay because he read a first version, and then I said I should expand the chapter on Augustine a little bit. And I mean, Augustine is also a world of himself.
Oh, of course.
So that took me another couple of months or maybe even a year. And so slowly, but finally, you also, I think René told me that once on the phone, you also have finally to jump and just, it's not complete. It will never be complete. You just have to release it. And I did it, and I was glad.
What was the most difficult part for you to write this book?
Uh,
Because I noticed in your book, you didn't start with mimetic desire in chapter 1.
Yeah, I started with the biography, and that was a little bit concern for Schwager, because he said, well, the people will starting reading your book and immediately think they have to be Christians, and they have to undergo conversion in order to understand Girard. But I thought at that time that this is a very crucial thing in mimetic theory, because the starting point was the city desire and the novel.
Yes.
And this book, the concluding chapter, which I see as a masterpiece of spirituality, of Christian spirituality, but even beyond that. And René Girard himself converted also just at that time when he wrote this concluding chapter. And he gave a lot of references to in the Shakespeare book and other books and articles on authors from literature, how important conversion is. So I thought I will start with that important part of his theory. And actually, I never got criticism for starting in this quite a steep and direct way. So that was no problem at all, contrary to what Schwager feared. The most criticism I got for the book, and this is, I think, well deserved. This book is more than 400 pages, but there is no criticism of mimetic theory or Girard.
Right.
And I felt I was at that time, and still are. Maybe I would today make some chapters where I go beyond Girard, but at the time I said I'm still exploring the potential of this theory. So make this little criticism at the end that this footnote is not okay or that footnote is missing is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And yeah, so some today, scholars have to start with criticism. They criticize the masters in order to show their own importance. And at that time, I didn't feel to go into that kind of usual academic rivalry.
You stayed away from the rivalry, so it was kind of like
of this rivalry, not of all rivalries, of course, but of this rivalry, I didn't.
How did René Girard have an impact on you, on your personal life, if I can ask? Did he have an impact on you on your personal life?
I think so, although it's a little bit difficult to really evaluate this precisely. But I remember that when I met him for the first time in 1986, I was quite engaged. In Stuttgart. I'm talking about Stuttgart, but in Stuttgart, I was a little bit disappointed after those 3 or 4 days of meeting. I mean, not disappointed that I got a better understanding of mimetic theory, and there were very interesting scholars there, and I became friend of some of them. But 1986, in Europe at least, in my own circles and in the Catholic youth movement, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and releasing Nelson Mandela was the political key issue.
Yeah.
And I addressed the seminar and also Girard, we should do something against that. We should not only talk about the anthropology of violence, we should also engage in freeing and releasing Nelson Mandela. And Girard was quite relaxed. I didn't want to go into that kind of political debate. Hamilton Kelly, who was from South Africa, was not so in favor of Nelson Mandela at that time. I mean, he was very careful. So I was a little bit disappointed politically. Later, when I studied with him at Stanford 5 years later, I felt that he is a teacher nearly impossible. I mean, you know that better than myself, but I observed that very, very often. he is not capable of criticizing his own students. So I saw very bad papers given by students of him in front of him, and he encouraged everyone. So I very seldom heard any criticism at all. But I think he criticized me once a little bit and said, Wolfgang, you are very political. So he didn't like this more partisan approach of myself, and that changed a little bit the longer I worked with him, and pulled out a little bit of those partisan political struggles. And I think also that I became more relaxed and also more solid about my own Christianity. I mean, I have to tell you, in order to understand that I was not raised in a religious family. So we didn't have a religious life. So I had religious education at school, but this was not deeply grounded in some way. And the more I spent time with him and studied the theory, the more I understood the religious dimension. And I mean, a couple of years ago, we published a Festschrift for René Girard with the title For René Girard, Essays in Friendship and Truth. Yes. And my own contribution to it is Drawn into Conversion. And in this piece, Drawn into Conversion, I just took a quick look today again into it. It's about 15 years ago that I wrote it, and was published 11 years ago. There I unfolded a little bit what it meant to become more solid in your own spirituality, in your own religious understanding. And so for me, the first couple of years, mimetic theory was very important also to make Christianity more plausible to myself from also a modern anthropological, philosophical point of view.
Christianity or Catholicism? Which one?
Christianity.
Not Catholicism.
Not Catholicism. I mean, studying Girard for a very long time, despite the fact that he was quite a devout Catholic person, and during the time at Stanford, I always joined him on Sunday at the Gregorian Mass, which was a little bit a hardship for my family. We had 2 boys, and they had to go with my wife and myself to the Gregorian service every Sunday. Despite the fact, I would say from a philosophical, theological point of view, Girard has a very strong evangelical, biblical leaning in the best way. So yeah. He is in some kind of evangelical Catholic, which is, at least from a European point of view, rather strange and not the typical Catholic perspective. So the Bible is much more important than philosophy. And I mean, the only funny thing is, if you read Battling to the End, yeah, he completely endorses Pope Benedict's Regensburg speech, also the criticism of the Protestant criticism of Greek philosophy. And this is a little bit strange, because you can read the whole work of René Girard and you will see that he exactly had this anti-philosophical attitude more or less throughout his life. So I think in the last book, when he was asked, do you support the Pope? As a Catholic, he was completely on the side of the Pope. But from his own understanding of mimetic theory, one should see that there is a cleavage between his writings and his strong emphasis on the Bible and a very critical stance on philosophy. I mean, one of the later seminars, we had a week-long seminar in 2004, a very small seminar organized by Bob Hamilton Kelly. Also, Peter Thiel was with us. And during this week, we tried to get some positive words out of him on philosophy, because we also discussed Eric Voegelin, Leo Strauss, and Carl Schmitt, but there was no word of a favor of philosophy. So this is a little bit funny to have this experience of the 1 week seminar in 2004 and then read in Battling to the End complete siding with Pope Benedict's rather philosophical approach on Christianity.
Right. Well, let me get back to Raymond Schwager before we talk about battling to the end. It seems like when René wrote Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, he raised a big scandal all over the world. And part of the scandal was his usage of the word non-sacrificial in Christianity. Jesus' death on the cross was a non-sacrifice. That was a big, scandal that he created with that term.
Yes.
And apparently Schwager made a big impact on René to change that term.
Yeah.
So can you illuminate?
A couple of years ago, a group of theologians in Innsbruck published a letter exchange between Schwager and Girard, and this is about 70 letters, I think, from each side. And I was the one who carried the letters of Schwager to Girard from Girard's garage back to Innsbruck for the publication project. But if you read this very interesting letter exchange, you see that from the very beginning, Schwager was questioning this very critical stance of Girard on the question of sacrifice. And in 1995, when Schwager turned 60, Josef Niewiadomski and myself, we published a Festschrift for Raimund Schwager and asked René Girard to contribute. And this contribution was a remarkable piece because this is the first piece where René Girard made it plausible why he was wrong on the question of sacrifice and why it was important that Schwager insisted on the traditional view. Although one has also to say Girard didn't give in on the substantial question that there is a fundamental difference between the human sacrifice of early religions and what we understand when we use the term or the concept of sacrifice in regard to Jesus Christ and the crucifixion. So what is important...
He didn't even address that in I Saw Satan Fall Like Lightning in that book?
I mean, no, he's addressing it from 1990 because the Festschrift contribution was from 1995, and I See Satan Fall Like Lightning was later. So from the middle of the 90s onwards, you will see again and again that he is addressing the question and also telling people that he was a little bit too critical on this concept.
Right.
So from the middle of the 90s, this was very clear. But it's interesting to see the position because it's not a cheap correction of himself. He just understood, and I think the best book in that regard is the last book, Battling to the End, that there is not only a deep and clear difference between what he called archaic religion and the biblical legacy, but there is discontinuity and continuity at the same time. And I think in the early period, he was so eager to show the difference that he has overdone the difference, emphasized the difference too strongly. And especially at the center of Battling to the End, there is this chapter on the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin, which I think is the key of this last book. And with Hölderlin, he corrects his more Nietzschean approach to this question. You know, Nietzsche was very important for Girard to show the difference by some similarities between Christianity and Greek mythology. But Hölderlin helped him to express the discontinuity and the continuity at the same time.
I see.
Yeah, and Schwager, of course, was crucial from a more traditional theological background. So, I mean, the letter exchange is really very important to read because you see step by step in what way Girard, Schwager, for instance, very early on said, Mr. Girard, when they were still in a very formal relationship. Is the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament your scapegoat? This is a question you will find in one of the very early letters. And later, Girard admitted that his understanding of the letter to the Hebrews was too superficial in the very beginning.
Right. Talking about battles to the end, it's very interesting because he writes in the foreword, in the introduction of the book, that he writes, he says, I'm going to be writing the most apocalyptic book that I've ever written. And do you, in your reading, I have a very, I think it's probably the most difficult book he has written. I still am having a hard time struggling with it. I'm reading it slowly, trying to understand it. Do you think he gives a solution to this apocalypse that he's panning out in the book? Battling to the end means we're going to be battling forever. But does he give a solution of any kind to this battling to the end?
I mean, this is a difficult question because I think there is a solution, but the solution is hidden in some way. So you have to read it very carefully. And I think he emphasizes on 3 or 4 passages, and they are spread out throughout the book. He emphasizes in a very Christian understanding the virtue of hope. I mean, Christian apocalypticism has to go along with hope. And I think the philosopher who expressed that early on was a German philosopher, a German Catholic philosopher, Joseph Pieper. And if you read Things Hidden of René Girard, from the French version of it was published in 1978, so very early on, you will find Pieper mentioned in his bibliography. So he read Pieper's book, I think the title is The End of Time. And in this book, you will find a very strong emphasis that Christians have to be aware of apocalyptic outcomes, but should never give up hope. And if you understand this deep connection between apocalypticism and hope, you can also find it in the last book. It's not very out into the open, but this book would be misunderstood if you overlook the emphasis on hope. And this hope is also, of course, connected again to Hölderlin, because the famous quote, where danger is, there is also solution or a good outcome. This quote was very distorted and used in a bad way by Heidegger, but I think the Girardian reading of it is one of the glimpses you find on hope in his book.
Right. But having said that, Girard was never a pacifist himself, and he never considered Christianity to be a pacifistic religion. So he doesn't give a potential possibility of peace in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I would differ a little bit in that regard. I'm just starting to work on a project, try to see similarities, but also differences between Gandhi's understanding of nonviolence and Girard. And interestingly, if you look a little bit deeper on the question of spirituality or the spiritual foundation of Gandhi's nonviolence, he's very close to Girard's anthropology and also the spirituality connected to anthropology. But I think Girard was never really addressing ethical or political questions in depth. And right. I even asked him, because from the very beginning, I became a professor of social ethics. So I had, just for professional disciplinary reasons, always addressing those questions. And I once asked René, did you ever immediately think about ethical or political consequences when you worked on your anthropology? And he said, no, that was never really important point of view of him. So I think this is a difference. But I mean, for me, Girard's anthropology is very helpful to address those ethical and political issues. So I think there is mimetic theory gives you a very important foundation to address those questions properly, not in a superficial partisan way, but in a deeper way. So I don't read Battling to the End as a political book in the sense that there is no hope and the war will go on forever. And I would again, there are some passages where he himself, even in this book, says there is always the possibility that human beings turn around and decide to become nonviolent. So you find these passages in this book too, but it's not a recipe or any kind of program that you can use as a politician or as someone addressing those questions directly.
Right. This is, the individuals have to put it down, and the whole masses have to turn around as well. So simultaneously. Yeah.
But at least one can understand how difficult the task is, and how, I mean, one of the similarities, for instance, between Girard and Mahatma Gandhi is that they both understood deeply how contagious violence is, And there is, I mean, if we talk about mimetic relations or mimesis, I think violence is one of the most contagious, most mimetically experiences of human life. And this was one of the reasons why Gandhi was so deeply convinced that whenever you can avoid to return violence for violence, this is the only way out of a cycle that would, and this is the strength of battling to the end, always escalate to extremes.
Very good. Let me ask you, what is your favorite book of René Girard? Since I would say you're authority on René Girard, especially after it's in your book on him and mimetic theory. So what is your favorite book that he wrote of all his books?
Yeah, this is a difficult question because it changes some way, but I just in fall a little book on Girard's distinction between the sacred and the holy will be published by Cambridge University Press. And in this book, it's a small book, but in my book, there's a central, very important chapter for me. And this is Girard's reading of the book of Job.
Oh, yeah.
Job, the victim of his people. This is the English title. Yes. And this is a tremendous book. This is so courageous and so blowing up a whole tradition of misreadings or sacred readings of Holy Scripture that I think the potential of this book has to be brought out into the light much more than it has before. I mean, it challenges Rudolf Otto's understanding of religion. It challenges Carl Gustav Jung's understanding of religion. It challenges all those who say religious is deeply ambiguous and the whole problem of violence is the ambiguity of the sacred. Girard's book on Job just finishes off this rather weird understanding of religion. It's tremendous if you look carefully into this book, how courageous he moved forward.
Absolutely. And what book would you recommend for beginners?
For beginners, I would recommend I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, because this is a book that gives a very sober, very good overview. So if you have all the important topics into it, and for people who are probably not so much into religion, but more interested in literature, still The City Science, the novel, is a very good book. And it's also, if you read it carefully, a masterpiece of spirituality. Maybe because it came out of his own conversion, maybe spirituality speaking the most important book.
The City Science, the novel.
Yes.
Romantique.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And in closing, let me ask you, Professor Palaver, in all this time that you spent with René Girard, what is one favorite memory you have of him? One or two favorite memory you have of him, if you can recall one or two good memories that you have with him?
One memory happened in my garden, just just in the garden. I'm looking at if I look out at my window. So we had a conference. I don't know the year now exactly, and about 10 colleagues, Girardians, just came for dinner to my house in the afternoon, and we went to a nice museum with old farming houses. And René didn't want to join the group, so we, the whole group, went for the whole afternoon, and he was just sitting in the garden and reading the German autobiography of Goethe. And this autobiography is so interesting because, in some way, Goethe is the German poet who seems to be completely unaware of mimetic desire, at least when he was the established poet. He, of course, knew mimetic desire himself when he wrote the novel on Werther. But in the autobiography, there is a tremendous insight written by Goethe where he goes back to the time he wrote the Werther novel, because he describes that he wanted to introduce a very close friend of him. He calls him Mephistopheles. He introduced him to a married lady Goethe fell in love with. And the friend said to him later on, I mean, this woman is not beautiful. I don't understand why you fall in love with her. And he then wrote, it is dangerous if a friend of yourself falls in love with the same woman you adore, but it's also very dangerous if he doesn't understand your adoration. And this is just one simple passage. So he read those things, and I was struck how good his understanding of German was. Right. And Schwager went with us to the farmhouse museums, and when we came back, he showed Schwager this passage, and Schwager was trying to interpret in another way and said, you misunderstand the German of this passage.
Right.
But I thought that Girard had the better understanding of this passage than Raimund Schwager, who was Swiss, and it was funny. So that's one of the very funny things. And I mean, the only person in this afternoon at his house was my wife. She was preparing the dinner, and René was just happy to be alone, to have some quiet time to read and not follow the crowd to the museum.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Professor Palaver, and thank you for your time and your insights on Professor Girard, and I hope to see you soon.
Yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity to think again and talk again about René Girard and his legacy that is so important for us.
Thank you again. Appreciate it.
Okay, yeah. Goodbye.
Goodbye.